Hello, welcome to another video from the Conscientious Biologist. This one's the first one in the disease playlist, and it starts us off on non-communicable disease. Now, if you've already watched the introduction to phase 2, there's a slight change from that because I put non-communicable disease as only one lesson, but I realized it's actually a huge dumping of information on you guys. So I split it into two. This is the first one of those, which is an overview of non-communicable disease, and we also look at cardiovascular disease. The second video that I've split it into looks at smoking and cancer as separate subjects. So this one we're going to start with is from the GCSE syllabus, and as I said, it is a lot of information. There's very little to understand in this unit. It's all very straightforward stuff, but it's a lot to remember and a lot to memorize, which is why I've broken it into these two videos. But let's get started by looking at the question of what is non-communicable disease. Thank you. So disease is generally categorized in two groups. You can have communicable disease and you can have non-communicable disease. But let's talk about what that actually means. So think of the word communication to start off with. Communication is the passing of information from one to another. So here's Barack Obama up here, one of my absolute heroes, giving a speech, communicating information. He's got stuff in his head, stuff that needs to be told to people. So he's communicating it very clearly and concisely so that other people gain that information. It's knowledge being passed from one to another. Now that word communication gives rise to this term communicable. So communicable literally means something that's passed between people. You communicate some facts from one to another. So think about what non-communicable means. It means it can't be passed from one to another. So put that in the context of disease, and what we're saying is that a non-communicable disease is one that affects the individual, but it can't be passed on. Communicable means passed on, non-communicable not passed on. So it only affects the individual. In other words, if we put it simply, it's a disease that you can't catch off someone else. So it's something that you might have or someone you know might have, but they can't pass it to you, or if you've got it, you can't pass it to them. Another word for this is non-contagious. You might have heard about diseases being contagious or non-contagious. It means the same thing. Now, there's a few categories of non-communicable disease. There's lots of ways you can break this down, but I've broken it up into four main groups. The first one of these is lifestyle associated diseases, then genetic diseases, mental and psychological conditions, and finally cancer. We're going to deal with each one of those in turn, but let's break the first one down. Okay, so lifestyle associated diseases. What we're talking about here when we say lifestyle is that they arise from choices you make as part of your own lifestyle. So it's kind of diseases you choose to have, although you don't consciously choose to have them. No one's going to consciously go, oh, I really want that disease. But because of things you do in your life, you're going to end up giving yourself that disease, or certainly put yourself at a much greater risk of that disease. Now, lifestyle associated diseases, if you look at the second point there, they're the biggest cause of death in high or middle income countries. So places like England, America, anywhere that's sort of highly developed, where people have lots of choice, generally a bit more affluent, have a bit more spare money, they're far and away the biggest killer. Way more than even the kind of the second, third and fourth combined. Significant killer, which is crazy when you consider they arise from things that you choose to do, which means, you look at the last point, they're almost entirely preventable. You just don't make those choices in your lifestyle. You adapt your lifestyle to avoid the things that are going to give you these diseases. This will make a bit more sense when we look at some examples here. So these are lifestyle associated diseases are correlated with risk factors or causal mechanisms. What I mean by those, and these are key terms that you need to know, both of those, risk factors and causal mechanisms. A risk factor is just a factor, something that you do that puts you at risk of the disease. Causal mechanism means it's not just a factor that puts you at risk. It means it's something you do that causes the disease. Now, the only real difference between those is how strongly linked they are to the disease. And we're talking there about the first word in this line, the correlated. If it very strongly correlates with the disease, as in if you choose to do this in your lifestyle, it almost definitely will give you the disease. There's a high correlation. People who do this get the disease. Then it's called a causal mechanism. That causes that. If doing this has a reasonable but not massive correlation to this disease, then this is a risk factor for that, but doesn't necessarily cause that. So one's a risk, one's a cause. Two key terms you need to know. But let's look at some of these risk factors or causal mechanisms. The main ones should be obvious. Diet and exercise, we're going to do a whole slide on that in a minute. Smoking, we'll do a whole slide on that. And drug abuse and alcohol, we can kind of put together because alcohol is basically the most widely abused but socially accepted drug that there is. Now we're not going to do a slide on alcohol, but you do need to know it in your specification. Alcohol is particularly bad and is a major killer because your body has to process alcohol using the liver and then clean the blood out with your kidneys. So one of the most common things that happens in people who drink too much alcohol is liver failure, but also their kidneys might start to fail. But it can also have knock-on effects to lots of different parts of their body because alcohol is a poison. Alcohol is ethanol. It's what you use in hand sanitizers and hand gels. It kills cells. So really, alcohol abuse is a terrible, terrible thing. If alcohol were discovered today, it would probably be classed as a really, really dangerous drug. It's only still socially acceptable because alcohol's been around for thousands and thousands of years and people have been using it all that time. So they're not likely to suddenly make it illegal as a drug. But it is a dangerous one, so remember alcohol. Let's move on to genetic diseases now. Now, hopefully you've watched the genetics lessons already, and certainly the sort of cell biology ones on proteins and DNA. So genetic diseases, what we're talking about here is that you're born with DNA or specifically alleles, and an allele is a version of a gene that leads to the condition. What we're saying is that your body makes the wrong protein. It should make all the proteins to keep you fit and healthy and everything functioning properly. But if you're born with a faulty allele that makes a protein that doesn't do its job, then the lack of your body's ability to do that job gives you a disease, whatever that could be. Okay. Now, there's lots of treatments available for genetic conditions, things you can do to prolong life, to make yourself feel better, to treat the symptoms. But there's very, very few cures for genetic conditions. But I'm going to add yet, because there's loads of research and loads of technology being piled into this to curing genetic disease using sort of reprogramming viruses to infect people with a cure for the condition and insert new genes. We looked at that in genetic engineering, using CRISPR gene technology to almost rewrite people's DNA. Transplants of, say, pancreatic cells to replace cells that can't produce insulin. There's loads of things that hopefully could be cures to lots of genetic diseases, but they're all quite experimental at the moment. Let's look at a few examples of genetic diseases. So a lot of these should be familiar to you. So cystic fibrosis was one that we talked through in the genetics lessons about genetic conditions. Cystic fibrosis, where you build up too much mucus in your lungs. It's a problem with membranes, for shifting things through the membrane. So mucus can build up, it can affect the digestive system, the reproductive systems, and that's genetic. You're born with that. Same with Huntington's is another condition, sickle cell anemia. You don't need to specifically know all of these. I'm just giving you examples that you may have heard of. Down syndrome, you're probably all familiar and seen people with Down syndrome. That interesting is where they've got a whole extra chromosome that creates Down syndrome, but you're born with it. It can't be changed. But you can't pass it on, hence why it's non-communicable. You can't catch Down syndrome, you can't catch sickle cell anemia. So these are non-communicable genetic diseases. The last one on there, type 1 diabetes. You do need to know about this. We'll talk about it more when we do the lessons on the endocrine system and control of blood sugar. Because really, type 1 diabetes is an inability to properly control your blood sugar. Because people with type 1 diabetes, the gene that they make for insulin, which is the main hormone that controls blood sugar, doesn't work properly. So the protein it makes isn't quite the right shape. Remember, shape determines its function. So if you're a type 1 diabetic, your insulin doesn't really work, so you can't control your blood sugar, and it can cause loads and loads of problems. But we'll talk about that more in one of the later lectures. Moving on to mental and psychological conditions as well. So many of these and so much variation on these. And mental and psychological conditions have both genetic and environmental influences. You can be born with types of neurotransmitter in your brain that make you more likely to have various conditions, or just problems with your brain cells and the way your brain is put together. But it could also be through trauma in your life, through things that you've experienced that push you towards mental conditions. So examples would include depression, so common, schizophrenia, anorexia, where you think you're fat, so you starve yourself and can almost starve yourself to death, and anxiety, so common in today's society where we all live such stressful, busy lives. Anxiety is a really serious mental condition, okay? But just like all the others on here, they're non-communicable. You can't catch these conditions. The last one on the list is cancer, which we're doing a whole slide on later in this presentation. But take a screenshot of all these. You'll probably want to add some notes to it if you print it out to go in your files for a revision. But there's a lot of information on here. Make sure you've understood it all. Okay, another big dumping of information on this slide. Remember, I did say this presentation is just lots of information coming at you. So do take screenshots at the end of each slide, print them all out, and it's just stuff to learn. There's not a lot I need to explain. But let's look at the first kind of risk factor in lifestyle associated diseases, which is diet and exercise. We had it on the last slide in the lifestyle associated diseases. This is one of the worst ones. The reason being is poor diet, lack of exercise leads to cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is absolutely the biggest killer in the high middle income countries, the more developed countries of the world, because of what people do in their lives, because of poor diet, poor dietary choices, lack of exercise, which sometimes just because of lack of opportunity, because we get so busy in our lives. But it's a real big killer because it can destroy the heart and the circulatory system as a whole. So let's look at some of the key parts of cardiovascular disease that are associated with poor diet and exercise. I've put these in a very logical order to make it as straightforward as possible, but it's just a case of learning these. So blood clots. So a blood clot is if you eat lots of foods that are high in saturated fats, that increases blood cholesterol levels. Now you get saturated fats mainly from meat fats. So from eating bacon, burgers, sausages, junk food, greasy food, all things like that, all things that are really nice that lots of us enjoy, but they will increase blood cholesterol levels. Now, cholesterol is quite a sticky substance in the blood, so it can make cells and other blood components clump together. So you literally get a load of cells and other stuff that's in there that forms just a lump of stuff stuck together inside your blood vessels. Now, the problem there is these can cause blockages, preventing blood from getting to the cells that need it. Now let's just recap some of our cell biology stuff and why that's so significant. So if I put a little bunch of cells above my head here, think those cells need to be delivered blood. Let's focus just on 3 of the key essential things those cells need to stay alive. Oxygen and glucose, because they're required for respiration. You react those two together to get the energy back out of glucose, and that energy powers these cells. But you also get amino acids delivered to the cells in the blood. And of course, you need amino acids to build proteins, and proteins do everything. So without the glucose and oxygen, these cells can't make energy. They can't get energy. They can't build any of their proteins. So very quickly, if there is a blockage there, so you'll see I've just put that little blockage just there now, look. If it blocks the oxygen and glucose and amino acids and any blood getting to those cells are very quickly going to die. Okay, the blood clots are so dangerous because if they block the blood from getting to areas of cells, those cells will die. Now, 2 really serious examples of that are these: heart attack and stroke, but they're both linked to the blood clots, because if blood is blocked from getting to part of the heart, cells in that area will die. Now, sometimes students get confused by this because there's 2 kind of different pathways I want you to think about for blood now. Remember the circulatory system lessons. Blood needs to come into the heart, inside the chambers, to be pumped out, to go to the lungs, to come back to the heart, to be pumped out, to go all around the body. That's blood flowing through the heart to pump it around the body. But don't forget that the heart is a muscle, so it needs a lot of energy. So actual heart muscle itself needs to be supplied with blood through coronary arteries. They're actually the first one when you get the aorta that comes out of the heart carrying the oxygenated really good blood that's about to go off around the body. The first bit of the aorta that branches off goes back to the heart in the coronary artery to supply blood to the heart muscle itself. If there is a blockage, if there was a blockage at the start of the coronary artery, no blood would get to the heart muscle. meaning the entire heart would starve of oxygen and glucose and amino acids, and your whole heart would die. That would be a major, massive heart attack. There's no coming back from that. Your heart is dead. Okay. But if that coronary artery branches into 2, 4, 8, 16, it keeps branching, taking the blood, spreading the blood all over the heart. Well, if there's a blood clot that just blocks one of those tiny arteries that are called arterioles, that's supplying blood to just a little bit of the heart up there, then that bit of the heart will die. Now, you've still got a bit of your heart that's died. It would hurt, you'd notice it, but that would be a minor heart attack. If the blockage was a bit further up and blocked more blood from getting to a bigger area of the heart, the more of the heart that dies, the more serious the heart attack would be. And it's exactly the same with a stroke, but a stroke is about the brain. It's where the blockage, a blood clot or whatever, is preventing blood from getting to areas of the brain. If bits of the brain die, that's when you have a stroke. So a stroke is where bits of your brain have died. And again, the bigger the area, the worse it is. So it could be a whole area that affects speech. So people lose the ability to speak. They lose the ability to walk or move or whatever, because the brain controls so much about you. But this is the key point with these. The severity of a heart attack or stroke depends on how many cells die, which kind of depends on how big the blockage is, how many arteries or arterioles got blocked. But it is, heart attack and stroke are just bits of your heart, bits of your brain that die. If a lot of them die, it's very serious and you will entirely die. Okay, let's look at the next one. This is high blood pressure. This is a massive risk factor for so many things. Okay, it's a really dangerous thing to have high blood pressure. And high blood pressure can be caused by a bad diet and smoking, as well as particularly bad. They can cause narrowing of the blood vessels. So your blood vessels literally shrink in, so there's less space inside them. You decrease the volume of space in all your blood vessels. But then really bad, if you've got a lot of salty food in your diet, which is in lots of junk food and processed food and things like that, salt in your diet will increase the volume of blood. Now, I want you to think about osmosis with this. Okay, it's a really common question in the exams about blood pressure. Think, if you're eating loads of salty food, that salt's going to move into your blood. If you've got lots of salt in your blood, then you've got a lower concentration of water because you've got a higher concentration of blood. Remember, it's a solute and a solvent. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you really need to go back to the osmosis lessons in the Transport Through Membranes playlist. But if you've got loads of salt in your blood, water is going to be pulled out of the cells around your blood to dilute that salt in your blood. It means you're putting more water into your blood, increasing the volume of the blood. But remember, you might have narrower blood vessels now. So what we're talking about overall, you've got more blood, but in less space. If you've got more blood in less space, you're going to get burst blood vessels. That's all high blood pressure is, that you've got too much blood in not enough space and the pressure is really big. So some of the smaller, weaker blood vessels, certainly capillaries, are just going to burst and break. That is just as bad as having blood clots that can cause blockages, because if the blood vessels are burst and simply aren't there, then they can't deliver blood to the areas. So those areas are going to die, and that can be throughout the whole body. So high blood pressure can lead to serious issues in multiple organs. Okay, so again, there's lots of information on here that you need to know, but one last thing, something that is a major risk factor for all of these is obesity, because obesity is where your whole diet is generally pretty bad and you're not getting enough exercise. And exercise, yes, can lessen the risk of all of these things over here. But basically, if you're overweight, your diet is bad, your cholesterol is likely to be high, your blood salt levels are likely to be high, your risk of blood clots is likely to be high. Obesity has been shown again and again and again to be a causal factor, causal link. There's a high correlation between being obese and having blood clots, heart attack, stroke, high blood pressure, kidney failure because of that, all kinds of things. So obesity puts you at risk of all of the rest of those. It's the major risk factor ahead of cardiovascular disease. Take a screenshot of this. It's lots more information, then we'll move on to the next one. So as I said at the start of this video, I have cut non-communicable disease in half into 2 videos. Head from this one now on to the second one of those, which looks at smoking and diseases that are associated with smoking, and then on to cancer as the final unit on this. Now, these are all still diseases that can't be passed on, that the individual suffers from without being able to give them to another person. As always, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel. You'll keep updated on what videos I release. Also, like this video if you've enjoyed it, and please head over to my Facebook channel where there's loads of extra infographics and bits of biology to flesh out your understanding of the entire course. Thank you.